approved. We are now convened in a workshop session. Let the record reflect the presence of those that are here. We have one item on the agenda, senior housing, and for the purposes of proceeding, I would recognize Village Administrator Rush.
Thank you. This evening we have a presentation by Michael Mays and Emily Rodman, and we also have our consultant with us, Valerie Kretschmer Associates, who we had requested some assistance in doing a market study for our senior housing efforts down on Janes Avenue. We have provided an extensive amount of background information to the board a couple weeks ago, including the report from Valerie Kretschmer, because there is so much material. Emily and Michael have boiled it down to an excellent presentation and memo, as always, and I'll turn it over to Michael. He can provide a summary.
Thank you very much. As Emily is getting your PowerPoint set up, just a couple of points. One, on the dais, you'll find a revised market study. There were a couple of typos within the market study that were corrected. The top page summarizes those changes, but I just wanted to point out that despite those changes, it does not change the recommendations of the market study. And as Ms. Rush had already mentioned, Valerie Kretschmer is the author of the market study. Valerie is here tonight to help answer questions regarding the market study. She has extensive experience as it relates to senior housing development and this type of analysis. And not an introduction, but an acknowledgement. Emily Rodman, who is our senior planner, has been involved in this process from the very beginning and has marshaled through the Pine Ridge redevelopment effort and the acquisition of the senior housing parcel. So I want to thank Emily, and Emily will be a part of the presentation this evening as well. Please let us know if you cannot see the PowerPoint slides. We can reduce the lighting. What we want to accomplish tonight are three things. We want to do a staff overview of the market study. We want to get your feedback on 4 questions, and then talk about next steps for the senior housing parcel that the village recently acquired off of Janes Avenue. The questions that we're going to be asking the village board this evening are, is the village board supportive of pursuing an LIHTC supported independent living facility on the senior housing parcel? And in the presentation, we're going to get into what that exactly is and explain the parameters of that type of senior housing development. The second question is, at what density should the senior housing facility at Janes Avenue be? Third question is, what process should the village utilize to solicit senior housing developer responses when we put together a proposal looking for a senior housing developer to acquire this parcel from the village and develop senior housing on that site? And the fourth question is to gauge village board interest in continuing to explore senior housing for the Janes Plaza Shopping Center. Just a brief overview of how we've gotten to this point. Back in April of 2008, the village entered into the agreement with the owner of the Pine Ridge apartment complex. That included the significant investment on the part of that owner to rehab the existing apartments into condos, to reduce density with the existing complex, and to eventually sell to the village a portion of the property. In October of 2008, we held a workshop before the village board to highlight and get feedback on where the village should be focusing our efforts to provide senior housing within the community. What sites should the village be looking at for senior housing? That was followed up in December of that year with a tour. We visited 2 facilities in the Chicago area, Sunrise Assisted Living in Naperville and Victory Center in Bartlett, to get a better sense of what the different senior housing facilities look like. In December of '08, we had a follow-up workshop following the tour. And in April of 2009, a Village held a senior needs workshop. We invited the community to come out and give us feedback on what were their needs, what were their interests as it relates to senior housing. And we had approximately about 35 residents attend that workshop. And I'll mention their feedback in a little bit. And then, of course, this year in January, we acquired the 3.4 acre parcel. We received input from the community in various ways. Through town meetings, the Community Needs Survey, the 2007 Neighborhood Strategy Area Plan Update, the workshop that I just mentioned, and through senior resident inquiries. To date, I think Emily has spoken to approximately 75 senior residents who are interested in senior housing within the community. A lot of the things that they have told us are that they want to be able to age in place, stay in Woodridge, at housing that they can afford. They are looking for transportation opportunities as it relates to the senior housing development. They're looking for activities to maintain physical and mental health, obviously a safe environment in which to live in, housekeeping and maintenance assistance, and social and fitness programs. I'm now going to turn over the presentation to Emily, and she's going to walk you through the results of the senior housing market study. And please, as we're going through it, if you have any questions for us or for Valerie, don't hesitate to let us know.
So I know you've all had an opportunity to look at the study in detail, and we will just try to highlight for you this evening and for the audience some of the key results that the study revealed. The objectives of the study were to evaluate the village's projected senior housing needs over the next 5 years. So the data covers 2010 through 2015. As it relates to those needs, we wanted to evaluate the type of senior housing that would be needed, and we'll go through the different types in a minute, the number of units that will be needed related to each of those different types, and then also the appropriate income level based on what our residents can afford. In addition to that, we wanted to evaluate how those needs could be met on the 2 different sites that we're looking at in the village, which includes the 3.4 acre senior housing parcel, as well as potentially the James Avenue Plaza Shopping Center. And finally, we wanted to evaluate the EAV impacts of different senior housing types. The study discusses 7 different types of senior housing. That would be the market rate independent living, the market rate assisted living, subsidized independent living, the low income housing tax credit, which is the LIHTC, you'll see that a lot this evening, the supportive living facilities, and then continuing care retirement communities, which are known as CCRCs, and age-restricted condominiums. Demand for those last 2 types up there were not evaluated as part of the study. In the case of CCRCs, they require much larger sites than the 2 sites the village is considering. So we did not evaluate CCRCs, as part of this study. And as it relates to age-restricted condominiums, because the market for condominiums is severely depressed at this time, they're not currently a viable option for the village, so those were not evaluated either. So we're going to quickly go through the different types of senior housing and the types of needs that they meet. The first is the market rate independent living. This serves residents that are 62 and over, but residents are typically in their 70s and 80s before they move into this type of housing. It's typically studio 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. It's rental or for sale. And it has a range of amenity and services, such as game rooms, libraries, various clubs, transportation services, and so on for residents. Meals are optional. Residents will have the ability to make meals in their individual apartments, or they could purchase a meal plan from the facility. And typically residents have to earn over $35,000 to be able to afford one of these facilities. And that $35,000 is per person, not per couple.
Well, I guess I would just say, most of these, it's singles who are living in them, but if it's a couple, there's usually like a second person fee that might be $500 that would cover meals and things like that.
The next type of senior housing is the market rate assisted living. This again is for residents over 62, but of course most of them are actually about 80 years old before they move into this type of housing. We'll talk a little bit about why a little later. These are residents that need assistance with activities of daily living, such as assistance with eating, bathing, and housekeeping. There are activities and services and meals that are included for these residents. They're typically rental communities. They are licensed by the state, and typically, again, because it's market rate, residents need to be earning over $35,000 a year. For the subsidized independent living, these particular facilities are funded through the HUD Section 8 or 202 programs. There are no meals included and only minimal activities are offered to residents. Seniors pay 30% of their income in rent, regardless of what that income amount is, but the maximum allowable income that residents can earn to reside in one of these facilities is $26,000 for one person, although typically the residents are actually earning less than $20,000. For the low-income housing tax credit independent living facility, the common areas and amenities are more extensive in these facilities than you'll see in those subsidized facilities. Meals, again, are optional for residents. Residents pay a fixed rent, and the maximum rents are set by IDA, which is the Illinois Housing Development Authority. Tax credit independent living facilities can include both affordable units as well as market rate units. And the typical resident income in these facilities is between $10,000 and $35,000 for the affordable units. The supportive living facilities are a form of assisted living that's administered by IDHFS. Residents are both low income and market rate residents. The low income residents pay all of their monthly income to the facility, and they're allowed to keep $90 a month as spending money. These facilities include all of their meals, healthcare, housekeeping, and so on, so they don't need to have a lot of their own income to spend. And market rate residents will pay a set rent that's typically $2,800 to $3,500 a month. There are a number of factors that influence seniors and their decisions to move into senior housing. What we're finding is that seniors are staying in their homes longer. Not only is the housing market making it difficult for seniors to sell their homes and raise the capital that they need to move into these types of facilities, but they also prefer to stay in the familiarity, if I can say that, of their own home as long as they can. In addition to that, higher income seniors are much less likely to move to senior housing than their less affluent counterparts. This is because they have greater resources, so they have the ability to bring in care if their needs change and they need nursing care or they need someone to help them with housekeeping and daily activities. In addition to that, they have other housing options. They're able to move to other locations or other housing types as their needs change, and they can still live independently. And then finally, because Woodridge has such a high percentage of our housing stock in multifamily, and that existing housing stock is very diverse, seniors can move to newer complexes within the Woodridge community and find housing that better meets their needs. So for example, our complexes such as Amley or the Gallagher and Henry condominiums, which are elevator apartment complexes, would be able to meet the needs of seniors. And then finally, as seniors age, their incomes decline. Many seniors may still be working in their early years and they may still have assets, but they begin to spend those down as they age. To review some of the demographic data from the study, this is a comparison of Woodridge senior households to Woodridge to the market area. So the market area, it constitutes a 5-mile radius from, I think it's from the James Avenue corridor essentially. So this is the 2015 population, and you can see that for the 55 to 64 cohort, the seniors as a percentage of the total population for both Woodridge and the market area is the same, it's 14%. But as seniors begin to age, you can see that Woodridge actually, the percentage of those age groups as a percentage of our total population is slightly less than that of the market area. This next slide compares Woodridge senior income to market area senior income, and you can see that although the difference is very, very slight, Woodridge seniors are slightly more affluent than those in the overall market area. It's just a difference of about 2%, so it's kind of hard to see. All of these demographics translate to specific housing needs within Woodridge and the larger market area. So we're going to review now the demand for each of the different types of housing that the study evaluated. For the Woodridge demand, so this is looking just at the Woodridge community, for market rate independent living was for 20 to 28 units. Because of the level of amenities that are provided in market rate housing, it's not cost effective for developers to construct so few units, and therefore facilities at this small number of 20 to 28 units are not viable. As it relates to the low income housing tax credit unit, the demand within Woodridge is only 26 to 31 units. And again, because that's such a small number, that would not be viable as a standalone facility. As it relates to the market area demand, so the 5-mile radius for independent living, the total demand for market rate units is 65 to 115 units. At first glance, it might seem that 115 units should be sufficient demand for a standalone facility. However, it's not significant enough demand for developers and for their lenders to be assured that the facility would be successful. Lenders and developers are looking for excess demand when they construct these facilities. So a facility of this size, based on these demand numbers, would not be viable. As it relates to the low-income housing tax credit facility for the market area, the number of units of demand is 129 to 184, which is actually a viable number. Moving on to assisted living, the demand in Woodridge for assisted living units is only 7 to 10 units, and for the supportive living is only 10 to 11 units, so neither of those types of housing would be considered viable as standalone facilities. As it relates to market area demand for assisted living, the demand for units for market rate is 23 to 35 units, and for supportive living is for market rate is 23 to 35, making it not viable. But if you look at the supportive living demand, which is 71 to 106 affordable units, that could be a viable development. So a quick summary of the conclusions of the market study show that there's not enough demand from Woodridge residents alone to support a facility, to support any type of facility. In addition to that, there's not enough demand in the overall market area to support market rate facilities, either independent market rate facilities or assisted market rate facilities. There is, however, sufficient demand to support a low-income housing tax credit facility, and Michael and Valerie will speak a little bit more to that in a few minutes. In addition to that, there's sufficient demand to support a supportive living facility if licenses become available in the future. And if you recall from one of the earlier slides, the supportive living facilities are licensed by the state, and developers must first obtain a license before they can build the facility. So even if the demand is there, nothing can be built until a license is obtained. The final component of the study was the evaluation of the equalized assessed value of different senior housing types. Staff had asked VKA to look at several existing senior housing facilities out there and evaluate their EAVs to determine if a certain type of housing resulted in a higher EAV. So I know this chart's a little difficult to read. It's the same chart you saw in your copy of the housing study that shows the results of their analysis. I'm just going to flip quickly here to the conclusions of that analysis, which show that the EAV of units ranges widely, even among the same property type or the same senior housing type. Part of the reason we see the variation among those properties is because some of the taxpayers or the property owners appeal their assessments, and they're successful in doing so and able to reduce their EAVs, while others opt not to appeal. And as a result, we see that market rate senior housing projects do not necessarily have a higher EAV than affordable projects or than the low-income housing tax credit or supportive living projects. Are there questions on the market study results before we move into the feedback questions?
Questions from board members?
I have a question.
Trustee Pittenger?
In the original slide when you started out with the summary describing where we were at and all that we've gone through, and then you've gone through the summary of what the types of facilities were. There were two facilities that we went to on that tour. Could you remind me what category of type of facility those two that we visited were?
Yes, we visited the Sunrise in Naperville. That is a market rate assisted living facility. And then we also visited Victory Center in Bartlett. If you'll recall, Victory Center had two buildings. One of the buildings was independent living and one of the buildings was assisted living, but that is a the LIHTC, the low income housing tax credit facility. Excuse me.
Their assisted living is a supportive living facility licensed through the state.
Okay, so the
program.
assisted living is supportive and the independent living is the LIHTC. So they have two different financing mechanisms.
Okay, and then, because I recall one of them was much more like apartments than the other one.
Yeah,
And that was
the independent living one would be much more like apartments.
okay. And that's the low-income housing tax credit independent living one? It's the
Yes.
one that looks more like apartments? Okay, thank you.
I have a question really just seeking to reaffirm, I think, what information was in here as it relates to the viability of the LIHTC prospects. And that is, there's a proposed development, I think, in Lisle and maybe one other community. And I think the conclusion was that even though those are underway or going to go underway, that would not negatively impact if we went forward with a similar development.
Yeah. There have been two separate proposals for Lisle. The most recent one applied earlier this year, a couple of months ago, to the Illinois Housing Development Authority for an allocation of tax credits. They were not successful. A different project applied a year earlier, was not successful, but both of those are still potentially in the pipeline in Lisle, according to the community development director there. It's very unlikely that both would get built because tax credits are very scarce commodities, so the state would not allocate two in the same year or even back to back in one community. But our analysis does show that there is more than adequate demand to support one in Lisle as well as one in Woodridge.
Thank you. Other questions from board members at this point?
Mr. Mayor?
Trustee Pittenger.
So for the allocation of those, I don't know if they're permitted licenses for the tax credit type facilities. Are there are they allocated or approved by the state just basically by demand, based on demand, or do you have some other input on how they would allocate them and the likelihood of them allocating a certain number?
Well, it's an extremely complex procedure that the state of Illinois has put together for this, and that's actually required by federal law. The tax credit program is known as Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code, so all of these regulations come from on high in Washington, D.C. So there's a document that's probably this thick that is called the Qualified Allocation Plan, referred to as QAP, and that lists all of the state's priorities and all of their requirements for developers who are applying for these tax credits. And it's a very complex process of putting one of these applications together. Typically, so basically the state says through this Qualified Allocation Plan, these are our priorities for how we want to allocate this scarce resource. So they have a certain portion of their funding that they say this will go to the city of Chicago. Another piece of their funding will go to the Chicago Housing Authority Plan for Transformation. Then there's another pot that will go to Chicago suburban communities that are not subject to the Affordable Housing Planning and Appeals Act. These are for communities. They have one pot for communities that already comply with that act, which Woodridge does comply with that act that requires at least 10% of your housing to be affordable. Then they had another pot for communities that do not already comply with that. Then there's another pot for rural communities and another pot for like metro areas like Springfield, Peoria, Rockford, that kind of thing. So Woodridge would be competing with other projects that people are submitting for these suburban Chicago communities. Then Woodridge is also competing if there's a senior project. They may also be competing with family projects. Somebody wants to build family apartments in the suburbs would be in that pot of money as well. And so there's this very intricate scoring process that basically corresponds to what the state's priorities are. So that's how these, what are known, I don't want to get too like nitty gritty on this to complicate matters, but that's what are known as 9% tax credits. And that is a highly competitive process. There is a second process that is available to developers and communities like Woodridge that are known as 4% credits. The value of these tax credits is less than they would be for 9%. However, these are pretty much allocated without a competitive situation. So, for example, with the 9% tax credits, they may get, they initially got about 150 applications. They then did a pre-selection and allowed about 100 to move forward to a full application. They got about 60, and then they approved less, they probably approved about 20. With the 4% tax credits, you're much more likely to get approved, and developers use those in conjunction with tax-exempt bonds that either the Village of Woodridge would issue, or they would cede their volume cap to the Illinois Housing Development Authority, which would then use their bonding capacity for this. So there are sort of two paths that you can go with that, and there's kind of a, you know, the financial modeling of these things really will determine which path you may want, you know, a developer may want to go here. Did that answer your question?
It does. Of course, it generates more questions. So the definition then of the tax credit comes in, the tax credit, well, that's the question. Is it in fact before the 9% on the building of it on the development side, which is the tax credit? Is that
yeah, basically, the way this process works is, you know, a developer will be allocated this, and that money, then they go, there's another, like a secondary market out there for the buying and selling of tax credits. Companies like, say, JP Morgan, you know, big banks or large companies that want to shield, you know, that don't want to have to pay more taxes, they buy these credits and to offset their tax liability. And typically, I mean, there's a market for this buying and selling of them, which right now is worth about 80 cents on the dollar. So a JP Morgan or somebody would pay 80 cents, maybe 85 cents. It really depends on the particulars of the project and the location to get this benefit. Those tax credits then become equity to the development. So that means that the developer, you know, uses that to offset money that he would otherwise have to finance. And the way these developments work, they're usually pretty tight in there. So there's a whole layering of different kinds of sources of funding and equity to be able to put together a viable project. Because one of the aspects of these projects is that for the affordable units, there's a maximum rent that you are allowed to charge. And that's set through HUD and by item. So for example, one person in a one-bedroom apartment, $848 is about the maximum right now that a developer could charge a person. So as opposed to, they could charge market rate tenants whatever they feel the market can bear. But for those units that are considered the affordable ones, they are rent restricted, so that obviously has a bearing on the income that's being generated, you know, cash flow from the property to then be able to pay your expenses and your mortgage as well. Does that make sense? Did I say that carefully enough?
That makes sense.
Okay.
So when we talk about the developer then in the scenario you described, the developer is then the entity that both builds and then runs the facility after it's built, right?
Yes, typically that developer does both. There are situations where there are partnerships that are put together where one partner may be the one that has the development expertise, and then there's a separate managing entity that's responsible for managing it. 95% of the time, anybody who walks into that building, there would be, you know, it's sort of a seamless kind of a thing. You know, it may not be that different from just a regular apartment complex that you may not realize that, you know, there's a different management company than the actual owner.
Sure. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Other questions at this point?
Okay.
I'm still struggling with saying LIHTC. I've been
Just
practicing.
just say tax credit. It's much easier.
We're now to the feedback questions. And so the first one that we're asking your feedback this evening is, do you support a mixed income LIHTC supported independent living facility for the senior housing parcel? Based on the study results, what Valerie and Emily have mentioned tonight, this type of senior housing product will best meet Woodridge resident needs by meeting local demand at all income levels. And again, this would be as a mixed income development project. It's the most viable option to respond to the market area demand. And as Emily had mentioned in her presentation, it has EAVs comparable to other type of senior housing development projects. Now, with this type of senior housing development, as I mentioned, it would include both market rate and affordable units. And based on the study, there is a total demand within that range of between 193 and almost 300 units within this market area. The number of market rate units will vary from project to project, but just to give you a sense, it can be anywhere from 10 to 60% depending on the funding and the size of the project. This is a photo of the Victory Center of Bartlett, which we toured in 2008, just to give you a sense of one example of this type of development. And this is an example of Mackenzie Falls in Bolingbrook. This is a more recent development that I believe opened in 2000.
Yeah, they're just finishing it up now.
So we're seeking your feedback on the first question.
Okay, it's time for feedback from members of the board, and you still may have questions that are appropriate before you respond to that, but let us give everyone an opportunity to respond to the questions. So time for feedback, and we'll start with Trustee Pittenger and just come right down.
Okay. I have a couple more questions then. I went through, and as I looked through this, the demand generation, when we talk about what the report, when it talked about the demand, is that the only facility type that we're saying that there's sufficient demand for, and with a combination? Because obviously there was some demand for others, but not sufficient enough to drive development needs and that type of thing. But we said.
Right.
But go ahead.
Right, I think the issue is, if you look through, we gave you information also on competitive properties that we looked at. And you can see that most of the straight independent living market rate properties are considerably larger than what we showed as the demand for market rate independent living here. So that what that means is there's a certain threshold that you need enough units to be able to supply all of the amenities and services and meals and kitchen staff and all of those kinds of things. So because there's already a fair amount of that in this area, we don't see that there would be, even though we show that there's that demand, it's not enough to interest a developer and get financing based on that amount of the number of units we show. Similarly, for assisted living, it's the same kind of analysis, though assisted living, there is vacancy in the market right now, so that in and of itself tells us that there is some softness in the market, and that would make it that much more difficult for somebody to come in and try and build something that would be totally market rate for assisted living. So when we look at what is the most logical and viable and probably most financeable kind of project, it becomes a project that is able to draw on the people whose incomes are less than $35,000, as well as for people whose incomes are more than $35,000. And that's where we end up with a tax credit finance development.
Okay. So the funding mechanism to put that in then, to support that type of facility then, is really, it's a combination of multiple things. The way I see it then is it's a combination of first of all what we're willing to sell the property for, because we do an RFP and we get a proposal. If we're willing to take a price lower than what would be market value for that property otherwise, in order to facilitate getting the type of developer and development that we want, then on one hand, we're financing and we're subsidizing the property in order to get the project. And then the second part of the financing comes through the developer, through the other process, which you described as complicated with the tax credits, which gives this type of facility its name, apparently.
Yes, I think that's correct.
Okay. So really what we're looking at is from a board, then we're looking at, this question is, do we support this type of facility, which is really the only type you're saying is viable? And then the second part is, our overall support indicates that the financing mechanism would be supporting the tax credit method, as well as selling it at a rate that would facilitate the property in order to get this project done.
Yeah, and I would say, that whole question about, selling the property and what is that number, I can't tell you at this point. I mean, that's likely to be a negotiated kind of an item, and the next phase of this work is doing the financial feasibility, and there are many moving pieces to all of this, so that's where we look at all of those things and look at, okay, how much could a developer afford to pay for land to make this project feasible. That's one way that the village could assist, but there could be other ways that through your TIF district that you may be able to assist. It's not like there would be only sort of one avenue to do that. That's something that, you know, again, you would look at, the developer would look at. We'll probably plug a few things in there into our financial model, but that would really be negotiated.
Okay.
And that's not a question we're asking of you tonight. As Valerie mentioned, the next phase will be, after we get direction this evening, to have her look at pro forma so that we come back to you and talk to you about what would be the appropriate sale price for the land.
Right, so we're not talking about finances, we're just saying that based on the market study, we've bought a piece of property, we've allocated it for senior housing, we've determined that there's one type of housing that seems to be suitable and there's market demand for it, and now, and do we support it? And I don't know how no is an appropriate answer at all, since we own the property already. So I guess I support it, yeah. And I am actually done now, thanks.
And I might have missed, we didn't hear your last part, Don.
Oh, no, I was saying that, no, I mean, based on the information that, you know, essentially we own the property and we've allocated as, the board did as a strategic direction, that we're gonna put senior housing there, we own it, then, and the demand really drives the fact that that's the only type that's viable there, and yeah, I guess that there's really no other choice than to support that, the way I see it.
Trustee Kagan?
I haven't had a chance, but I know that I've shared particular viewpoints with Dave in this matter. My biggest thing is, as Dave says, we own the property, we've spent money on it. It's the option, the opportunity, do we spend more money in the future, do we take care of it now? Obviously, the fact is, for developers to be interested in it, we're gonna have to price it at, I'll say in the sales term, a price to move. I'm concerned that ratio of the price to move versus the value that the village gets back on, not even on our investment, but just on the outlay of capital, needs to be relatively close to a break even, because I think it's a very bad precedent for the village to buy property and sell it for less than what we got it for, without major considerations. And the fact is, we're developing an asset in the community, in a senior housing parcel, offsets a little bit of the ability, to take the loss on it. I am concerned about the complicated nature with the tax credit. I've had sufficient opportunity to review how a lot of the decisions are made in authorizing those tax credits for those communities, and it's a steep and arduous path to follow because of the fact that it involves state funding, and we all are all too well aware of the difficulties in the state to sometimes just take care of it, paying its obligations to us on other matters. So I have concern there that as the state continues to work its way through its budget crisis, that this is just one of the things that'll take a year to solve with them and drag on. So I'm in favor of proceeding with the idea of a low-income housing tax credit project there. I just want to, again, let staff know that my biggest concern is that we try to minimize the overall loss of capital to the village on this project.
Thank you, Trustee Kagan. Trustee Cunningham Pizza?
Can I answer?
Yes, please go forward.
Just one point that you made there. Yes, we all know that there are state issues, financial issues. The allocation of tax credits is not something that comes out of the state's budget. There are other sources of financing, such as a housing trust fund, that do come out of state coffers, but the tax credit itself, because it is a federal program, is not impacted in the same way. I will say the state's supportive living program that we talked about, that comes through the Department of Healthcare and Family Services, that is the operating subsidy, basically, that goes to the developers for running them. That comes through the Medicaid program. There is definitely some pressure that the state has been facing on that, even though it costs the state less per day, per person, to put a person in a supportive living facility than in a nursing home if they're on Medicaid. So that was the reason why this program was developed. You know, both it's a better way for people to live as well as cost effective.
Trustee Cunningham, you'd say?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for all the information that we have received. It is just a huge compilation of information, and but very helpful, I think, in understanding kind of where we are at today. So based on all the information and understanding what my fellow trustees have already said, I do support the tax credit and would be fine to go ahead and proceed based on all the information we've received.
Thank you. Trustee Beavers?
I have one question. On one of the slides, you showed that it's going to be a split between mixed and low-income tax credit. But we wouldn't know at this time what that split would be.
Correct. There are so many factors that would be involved, going back to what Valerie alluded to with the 9% versus 4% tax credit. If a senior housing developer is applying for the 9% credit, the typical break would be 10% market rate, 90% affordable. If they apply for the 4% tax credit, then it can be up to 60% market rate. So that would all depend on the responses we would receive as to what would be the breakdown between affordable and market rate.
And there's also the issue of the structuring of the deal. You know, there's got to, it's a real balancing act of lots of moving pieces to figure it all out. So that's why we say this is kind of, the law will allow up to 60% market rate in a 4% tax credit deal. You may not get that much given the actual rents, et cetera, of how a deal would be structured.
And I guess the reason I'm asking is my concern is when we get to that point, if the demand will meet whatever we come up with. You know, like if we say we have X% market rate, but the demand's not there, then what happens? You know what I'm saying? Because you've said here what the demand is, but if we get to some point and the demand is less than this equation that we come up with, then what happens?
Well, and I guess
And I can, yeah, let me answer that. Typically, a developer is, you know, again, they're going to be looking at what, you know, a market study says. They're going to be looking at what works financially for them, setting the rents, because the rents that you can charge for the market rate units are higher than what the law will allow you for the others. So they'll be looking at all of that, and once they apply and get their approvals based on a certain set of financial projections, they need to stick with that. Now, there sometimes is, you know, some leeway. We sometimes find is that, well, maybe the demand is a little stronger for one type versus the other type, and sometimes they have leeway in moving that around. Sometimes, unfortunately, somebody may come and say, you know, I'm a market rate, I don't fit the income for affordable, but they have to find somebody who fits under that, or vice versa. It just depends what's available. But again, this would be something that the developer will look at very closely to determine what makes the most sense for their project at this location. And, you know, in part, it's going to depend on some of the things that you all decide here as well.
So we won't have any effect on that at all then? It'll just be all up to the developer. You say our effect will be if we grant them any kind of leeway or give them any kind of incentives?
Well, I think, you know, typically developers like as much leeway as they can have. You know, I think you probably have seen that in lots of other things. But there are, you know, you may have certain goals that you would like a project to meet. And so it certainly would not be unusual to have negotiations back and forth where the developer says, well, I think I want to do it this way. And you say, well, we kind of like this. And I mean, I've seen situations where a village would say, we would like, you know, the first priority to go to village residents. Or, you know, right of first refusal for village residents and the parents of village residents. You know, something along those lines. You know, we've seen that, and then where developers usually would say, okay, we'll start our marketing first to village residents. And then, you know, depending on what we get there, how much we fill, then we'll open it up to residents from outside of the village. So there are things like that that are also possible, you know, depending on how something is structured with the village.
Okay. And Michael, I don't know that we've even gone down that path or even thought anything like that, have we? I mean, we haven't given any type of consideration.
Correct, and that's when we get to the third question regarding which process to go down.
Okay.
I think it'll help, we'll kind of explain the differences between the processes, but through that process, we'll help to answer those questions and get further direction from the board on what exactly you're looking for out of that senior housing development.
Okay. Then I would be in support. My only concern is, you know, that it's structured so that we meet the demand and we don't have this lopsided, you know, more of one than the other, and then the demand doesn't meet what we have. Okay.
Thank you, Trustee Beavers. Trustee Banks.
It's nice to be the last person to be able to give the feedback, because you get to hear.
It certainly will be.
Oh, I'm sorry. It'll be nice to hear you as well, Mayor. I have to echo Trustee Cunningham Piesak's thoughts on the information that was provided to us, that has been provided to us, and I have to thank staff as well as Ms. Kretschmer for the detailed information. It really helped me in making a decision just based on all of the information that's been provided. I do feel that the time and effort that has been put into this project, it does, in my opinion, it warrants us to move forward with this. I think it's been a long time coming. Senior facility has been a long time coming in the village of Woodridge. There's been a lot of feedback from the residents of the village. It's been a priority. I think we are moving in the right direction. Just based on the information in the packet, I think it would be advantageous not only to the developer, and I'm sure it will be because of the tax credits that's allowed, but also to the potential residents that would be looking at moving into the facility. Anytime you have a situation where you can base a project on income, where you can include people that don't have the income but still warrant and deserve a decent place to live in their senior years, that's an advantage to everyone involved. So just based on that information, based on those thoughts, I do agree and feel that we should move forward with the LIHTC.
Thank you, Trustee Banks, and I would simply echo my colleagues and favor going forward, which brings us to the second question.
At what density would you like to see the senior housing facility? And let me start by just saying that I certainly can understand and appreciate at this point, without having specific examples to look at, you're not going to be able to give us obviously clear, definitive feedback on, I'd like to see a 72-unit senior housing facility. What we're hoping to accomplish tonight is to get feedback from you on a general range of density, because whether we go down the RFQ or the RFP process, which I'll explain in a little bit, having that type of feedback will be helpful, because that will let the senior housing developers know what are our general expectations on density. Certainly, if the village only wanted a 45-unit facility, for example, and that wasn't expressed in the RFQ and the RFP, you would have senior housing developers that may respond and say, well, look, that's not viable, I can't do that. So that's why we want to get a general range from you on the density for this site. And as we look at this question, just want to provide some basic information to you. Current zoning for the property is A2. Maximum density in the A2 zoning district is 16 dwelling units per acre. Before the agreement with the owner of Pine Ridge, the density of the apartment complex, which was 195 units, that density was almost 12 dwelling units per acre. Now with the sale of the 3.4 acres to the village and the developer's reduction in overall units within the portion that is going to be the condos, the density is going to be 9.2 dwelling units per acre. And obviously the balance of the property, which is what we've recently purchased, there's no density at this point. What I want to do is show you some examples of different senior housing developments in the Chicago area and at their density levels. And what we've done is we've included pictures so you can kind of get a sense, a feel of what the different density ranges look like with these different complexes. So this is the Mackenzie Falls that I showed you before. As you can see, it's a lower density development at 7.6 dwelling units per acre, single story. Meyer Commons, this is right next door in Darien. It is at 10.2 dwelling units per acre, 2-story.
Actually, part of that is 3-story. It goes 3-story in the back.
Thank you. Can't see that from this photo.
Or from the main road.
Victory Center, which we've mentioned to you before, at 20 dwelling units per acre. Heritage Woods, which is in Bolingbrook, and is a supportive living facility at 30.4 dwelling units per acre. And as you can see, 3 stories. This is Emmanuel Residences in, I believe, Downers Grove.
Yeah, downtown Downers Grove.
Yeah, at 54.8 dwelling units per acre, multi-story building. So that is the range of some of the different examples with senior housing. And we also wanted to give you a sense with some specific unit examples of what the density would be and what the projected EAV would be based on the survey analysis that was done as part of the study. So if you were to look at an 80-unit complex on the senior housing parcel, that would be 23.5 units per acre. The EAV that would be projected after build out, $1.6 million. 100 units, 29.4 units per acre, a little over 2 million in EAV. 120 units, 35.3 units per acre at $2.4 million for equalized assessed value. We're looking for your feedback on density, and again, this is very preliminary. We're looking for a range of what you would feel comfortable with. We certainly realize there's going to be a lot more as part of this process, certainly after the RFQ and RFP, for you to fully evaluate more specific examples and eventually some proposals so you can get a better sense of how these different types of units in terms of scale, density, height will look like on the senior housing parcel.